Okay. Oh, wonderful. Well, good morning. Good morning. Good morning. I'm so pleased that we've got a crowd here at Friendly House, about 20 people, because I-5's closed, as you all know, and we were worried that no one was going to show up, but so glad you're here. We have an in-person speaker, so we've got an audience for him. Also want to welcome our Zoom audience. Thank you for showing up. We've got a special treat today because one of our scholarship winners is going to be doing a reading. So our reading will go a little bit longer than usual, and we'll have a few minutes to ask Evelyn, our winner, to ask her a few questions if you wish to. So our meeting might run just a little bit long today, but we'll be fine. I want to make sure our wonderful speaker has plenty of time to present his topic. What is humanism? Well, humanism is a philosophy informed by science, inspired by art, and motivated by compassion. Humanists strive to lead meaningful and ethical lives and use reason and empathy to guide their decisions and actions. We do this because we honor the fact that this is the only life of which we are certain. As humanists, we affirm the dignity and worth of all people. We do this not only to acknowledge all that humans have accomplished in the arts and science and humanity, but also simply for the possibility for peace and well-being when people interact with respect for one another. Our reader today is a young woman from Cleveland High School. Her name is Evelyn Belisle. She is one of the HGP Scholarship winners, and she's going to read her essay to us now. Welcome, Evelyn. Come on in.
Thank you. So the prompt I responded to was 52 years ago, John Lennon's song Imagine included the concept of imagine no religion. Since then, the United States has become less religious, especially among younger generations. Is this a good trend? Is religious backlash a current threat to our democracy? And my response to this was, ever since fifth grade, where I watched Trump get elected, I've become increasingly aware of the presence religion has in our government. I am tired of pretending there's a separation between church and state in this country. While I acknowledge the US is less influenced by religion than certain other countries, I do not ignore the impact it has. Religion is weaponized in this country to force beliefs onto others. Then again, last year, when the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, my whole life was forever changed. I have sat and watched our Supreme Court make decisions based on religious beliefs when they are supposed to uphold the law in an unbiased fashion. Not only were my rights being stripped away, not only was my body being controlled by a book that was written over 2,000 years ago, they were also setting a terrifying new precedent. It made many of us wonder what will be next. If the one section of our government that is supposed to not be influenced by outside pressures clearly makes a decision based off religious teachings, what does this mean for the future of our democracy? I watch as my future becomes increasingly morbid. When the Supreme Court overturned Roe v. Wade, it was clear that religious backlash was a threat to our democracy. This is because there are decisions out of line with the majority of Americans' views and the Constitution. Basing our entire country off of one religion not only is a threat to our democracy, but it undermines our nation's foundation that all are created equal and the establishing of freedom of religion. Growing up, I was raised as a Unitarian Universalist whose core values believe that there isn't one correct belief or religion. As I've gotten older, I don't associate with any religion. I've grappled a lot with the concept of religion. In many ways, I see religion as a coping mechanism to find meaning and answers about this constantly changing world. I've always been envious of people who believe in religion because I would rather have an optimistic outlook on life. This curiosity is what led me to take IB World Religion's junior year of high school. I learned about the complexities religions hold and the roots of certain values. It helped me see things from multiple perspectives and realize that major religions have similar core values and good intentions. I personally believe that many religions have promising aspects. which is why I don't believe it is a good thing or a bad thing that the US is becoming less religious. However, it isn't as simple as I would like it to be. While religion provides hope, compassion, and community, all aspects our country is lacking, it also fosters ignorance, superiority, savior complexes, biases, and inherent stereotypes. Either way, it has no place to make decisions for others. I don't think that religion is the true problem here. If everyone accepted and respected each other's opinions and beliefs, the religious backlash wouldn't be as much of a problem. We need to be able to follow our own beliefs while also looking at it from all perspectives. We need to be able to unpack our biases to understand if our choices are truly our own. We need to become aware of when religion is influencing decisions surrounding others. It's important to be able to associate with a religion while also knowing its limits. We can't blindly trust one idea. One idea I like to consider is if someone who wasn't Christian was president and a lot of people in that same religion were in the Supreme Court making decisions based off that religion. The people of America would quickly see the issue and feel the need to change this. Christians are getting away with so much more than other marginalized religions. If this were any other religion, this wouldn't stand. One example of this is when 9/11 happened. An entire religion was being discriminated against because 19 of them performed a terrorist attack. There have been an unreasonable amount of times a Christian has shot up a school or started a war, and this same discrimination wasn't done for all Christians around the world. This is why I believe religious backlash is a current threat to our democracy. We have seen firsthand how even political parties are being influenced by religion. We can't recognize, if we can't recognize this issue and accept the fact we have a problem, we're going to get nowhere. This is one of the reasons why I look forward to becoming involved in policymaking and nonprofits that will help lessen the impact of these religious biases. I crave to make a difference in our country and ensure democracy of our people, not religious beliefs. Our country is in a dangerous place right now, and I want my education and career to aid me in providing the resources to do something about it. We can't sit back and watch our rights continuously be stripped away. We can't watch these systems of oppression suffocate us. The US becoming less religious isn't a good thing or a bad thing. What is important is that religion isn't the basis for governmental decisions and it's not used to deny people's human rights.
I have a question real quick. Where are you going to, what's next? Where are you going to college?
I'm going to the University of San Francisco to study sociology.
Excellent, wonderful. Oh, we have a question from Joyce. Go ahead, Joyce, ask your question.
Understand something about the Bible. What in the Bible, you made reference to that book, what in the Bible is used to justify, or there's no reference at all to anything about abortion. Where does that come from?
Yeah, and to be honest, I'm not sure because, I wasn't raised Christian or Catholic, but I do like there's a certain word of like I don't know exactly, but there's something about always like wanting life or to not like ruin a life, and I guess people consider fetuses like life, so I think that's kind of where it like comes from because there's like so many interpretations. I think that's one of the problems with the Bible is that people are following it so closely, but everything's just an interpretation.
A question from Roy. Go ahead, Roy.
Why do you suppose that among your cohorts, or well, maybe young people your age, that your point of view is being minority?
I think that it really depends on like how you've grown up. I mean, even when I was writing this essay, like I kind of went back and forth. Like, first off, I just thought like, yes, like it's a good thing that people are becoming less religious. But, the more I thought about it, I realized that that's not the true problem. And I think that a lot of people in my generation, they I've really tried to understand religion because it's always fascinated me, and I think that maybe that's what they're lacking because if I didn't go out and ask all these questions and take these classes, I would have also just been like I wouldn't have been in like the same view that I have now if I hadn't done all of that.
I so appreciate that you were willing to come on and read today. Congratulations on being a scholarship winner, and good luck with college in the fall. That's you're heading in the right direction.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Our topic today, the Olmsted Legacy Across America, incorporates the humanist commitment of environmentalism. Just as we depend on the planet to sustain us with its precious resources, this planet's ecosystems depend on us to be good stewards of the land that we inhabit. Laurence Cotton, who will be our presenter today, will be presenting this important topic. He is a writer, historian, and filmmaker. Laurence originated the PBS film Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing America. He served as the lead content provider and consulting producer. He has a bit of a fun story that he shared with me, in that Laurence and Ken Burns started together as classmates at Hampshire College. They both studied with the same film and photography faculty, and during their sophomore year were members of the same student team that produced their very first documentary together. However, Laurence majored in cultural anthropology and minored in visual arts. He initially set out on a very different career path, whereas Ken Burns majored in film, and as they say, the rest is history. Welcome. So glad you're here.
There we go. It's a pleasure to join you all here today. Thank you, Helen, for the introduction. And thanks to Joyce Lackey for a long-term friendship here with the Humanists of Portland. Actually, my friend Carl Levin, who I think some of you know, is the individual who actually first introduced me to your organization quite a few years ago. I don't know if Carl's with us online today, but hello to everyone in the room and hello to everyone online via Zoom. Thanks to the AV team too, of course, for setting this. Actually, I'm impressed. The technology that's in action today, to me, is very impressive for a small nonprofit organization. So, by the way, I've just come from, one or two of you know, because of our exchanges on email, I've actually just drove back from Seattle yesterday, and actually I've just returned from 2 back-to-back summits and conferences. One here on Portland, on the Olmsted Parks of Portland, with a very important national visitor from Washington, D.C. last week. I was one of the co-hosts of that summit 10 days ago, and an international parks conference in Seattle with participants from around the world, a large delegation from Canada. I was very impressed with. It's called the City Parks Alliance Greater and Greener, and it's a biannual event in a different city in North America every 2 years, and the gathering in Seattle was nothing short of extraordinary. And so I'm all energized and exhausted by participating in these 2 events back to back. So now, by the way, Helen mentioned the environmental context of this story. Well, yes, arguably, Mr. Olmsted, who you're going to be learning much more about shortly, was an early conservationist, arguably an environmentalist. But you're also going to hear, first and foremost, he was a social reformer. That's how he identified himself. So allow me to introduce this gentleman, Frederick Law Olmsted. Here is a color, and I'll be quoting quite liberally, by the way, as a historian, a writer, filmmaker. I like to use primary materials. So allow me to introduce Frederick Law Olmsted. Here's a colorful description of the man, by his friend George Templeton Strong. Some of you might recognize that name, a well-known public figure and diarist of the day. He is an extraordinary fellow, decidedly the most remarkable specimen of human nature with whom I've ever been brought into close relationship. Talent and energy, the most rare, absolute purity and disinterestedness, prominent defects, a monomania for system and organization. He works like a dog all day, sits up nearly all night, doesn't go home to his family for 5 days together, works with steady, feverish intensity until 4 in the morning, sleeps on a sofa in his clothes, and breakfasts on strong coffee and pickles. Now, I don't know about you, ladies and gentlemen. I've been known to breakfast on strong coffee, as I did this morning. However, you'll be pleased to know I did not start with strong pickles as well. Well, here is Frederick himself reminiscing on his boyhood. I was very active imaginative, inventive, impulsive, enterprising, trustful, and heedless, a troublesome and mischievous boy. I was nominally the pupil of a topographical engineer, but really for the most part given over to a decently restrained vagabond life, generally pursued under the guise of an angler, a fowler, or a dabbler on the shallowest shores of the deep sea of the natural sciences, from his autobiographical materials. Well, that mischievous boy turned vagabond certainly eventually made something of his life. I hope you come away from today's program with a more enhanced feel for this man and what made him tick. Central Park, Brooklyn's Prospect Park, that's Longmeadow, Boston's famed Emerald Necklace, the White City of the Chicago World's Fair, the park systems of Buffalo, here's Delaware Park in Buffalo, Louisville, here's Cherokee Park in Louisville, an entire park system. Legacy parks in Chicago, here is the Japanese Garden inside Jackson Park in Chicago. Here we have Belle Isle in Detroit, an entire island park, the largest island park, largest river park in the United States. Here is what's up next? We have a delay. Okay, there it is. Olmsted Linear Park, Druid Hills in Atlanta, an extraordinary, beautiful area of Atlanta. Maybe some of you know that part of Atlanta. The Biltmore Estate, of course, all of you know the Biltmore Estate. I dare say many of you have been there in Asheville, North Carolina. How about in our nation's capital, the U.S. Capitol grounds, the green suburb of Riverside, Illinois, Mount Royal Park in Montreal. How do you think the city got its name? It's Mount Montreal, Mount Royal Park, the Olmsted masterpiece of Canada. And the Niagara Falls State Reservation on the New York side of the waterfall complex, the first state park in the nation. Those are just a handful of the more celebrated masterful landscapes designed by Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. But if you add in the park designs and landscapes carried out by his two sons and the Olmsted brothers firm, the imprint across the geography of North America is simply astounding. 700 public parks and 6,000 commissions across all of North America, north to south, east to west. I want to share a few items from media coverage in the past decade or so, with an initial focus on the West Coast. You know, it's interesting to me, though I've lived on the West Coast for nearly 30 years. I was raised in New England. I'm a native Bostonian. I do more than frequently travel around the U.S. presenting this program. When east of the Mississippi, audiences there think they own Olmsted, particularly New Yorkers, but I dare say I would add in Bostonians and Buffalonians. They think they own the Olmsted name. Well, we'll see the Olmsted legacy does indeed spread across the entire continent. On the opinion pages of the LA Times in the fall of 2015, a column titled "Building a Livable Los Angeles." Let's give you a nice picture of downtown LA if we can have this system cooperate with me. Here is a beautiful picture, of course. Well, some people would think it's beautiful, but there's sprawling downtown LA from the view of the Griffith Observatory while you're beholding this picture from the LA Times. In 1930, with LA's population on the verge of exploding, the sons of Frederick Law Olmsted were commissioned to drop a master plan for the Los Angeles basin. The brothers came back with an intensive study of the ecology of the Los Angeles watershed, including plans for Parks Place, flood control, traffic abatement, recreation, and the city's overall ecological development. The report was praised for its vision, clarity, and beauty, and it was immediately shelved. 1930, they had planned an emerald necklace for LA. It was not acted upon. Just think about that. I'm going to return to that topic later. Perhaps some we have a very well-read audience here today. I know this. Perhaps some of you are readers of the New York Review of Books. A number of years ago, there was an article titled "America's Green Giant" by a scholar named Martin Filler, including discussion, here we are, including discussion of new volumes by and about Frederick Law Olmsted, including this one featured here. After initially, scholar Martin Filler, after initially calling attention to the claim that has been received by the High Line Linear Park, there it is, along Manhattan's west side, scholar Filler writes this in the New York Review of Books. Yet, however much the High Line has enriched the post-millennial megalopolis, its social effects pale in comparison to the revolutionary vision of the public park as promulgated by its greatest American exponent, the 19th century polymath, Frederick Law Olmsted. Maybe during the COVID winter of 2021, in the pages of the New York Times, some of you might have read this moving essay by Michiko Kakutani who is in fact an avid bird watcher. The heading was Finding Refuge and a Snowy Owl in Central Park. Let's give you a nice wintertime picture of Central Park. Well, let's maybe give you a nice wintertime picture. Here it is. So there's Central Park in winter. I'm reading just an extract from a much longer column of hers. Central Park has long provided a refuge from the anxieties and stresses of daily life, perhaps never more so than during the time of the coronavirus. New Yorkers who visited the park every day, as well as those who had long taken it for granted, felt a renewed love for this amazing rectangle of green in the heart of the big city. Its startlingly lush woodlands and rolling lawns, its meandering trails and wide open meadows, and of course, its astonishing wildlife, including owls. Here is the very snowy owl, including owls, hawks, herons, and a dizzying array of other birds who for generations have used Central Park as a vital rest stop in their migratory travels, knowing what many humans only came to fully appreciate during the uncertainties of the pandemic, that the park is a beautiful and essential sanctuary. And by the way, having just come from this conference that I referred to at the top of this program, parks are not amenities. They are essential civic infrastructure. There's no other way to put it. They are essential civic infrastructure. We take them for granted. City leaders take them for granted. The public takes them for granted. They're not amenities. They're as important as any infrastructure, highway, bridge, tunnel, public transportation system, social services, absolutely as essential. And we do harm to ourselves by thinking them in any other fashion. Just to give you a sense of the path that brought me to this film project, when I was young, I would visit the house of my maternal grandparents, very near Boston's Franklin Park. As an adult, I would regularly walk along Olmsted's back bay, the Fens, and the Fenway. Here's a characteristic bridge in the Fenway, maybe. And visit the Museum of Fine Arts and the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, a couple of Boston's more well-known museums. I would jog around Jamaica Pond, there it is in all its beauty. I would botanize and stroll around the Olmsted-designed Harvard Arnold Arboretum. All of those parks are integrated into Boston's famed Emerald Necklace, a crescent of Olmsted-designed parks and parkways that wind around a major portion of the city. I would also, of course, visit Central Park and eventually come across Prospect Park in Brooklyn. There, the first time I entered through this arch, Endell Arch, and looked down the expanse of the long meadow in Prospect Park, tears welled up in my eyes as I was overwhelmed by its sheer beauty and utter perfection. Perhaps some in our audience today saw our original PBS film, Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing America. There it is. That's the cover of the DVD. Perhaps you saw that, the original PBS broadcast. Perhaps you managed to locate it on PBS or one of the streaming platforms. Well, I learned very shortly after moving to Portland, Oregon, nearly 30 years ago, that the entire park system here was master planned by another Olmsted, the stepson, John Charles. So about 16 years ago, after completion of a prior film, thinking about what would be next, I began to read Olmsted biographies, doing a little research. Before long, I approached an old friend back in Massachusetts, who I always have to give credit to my collaborators, Laurence Cotton, an associate of Ken Burns, and I proposed a collaboration. So in 2014, our film premiered before live audiences in key Olmsted Park cities in America. And I've been fortunate ever since then to continue to present the film across the US. You could say that is what brings me here today. I also have other films, by the way, that I've produced since then. Another one is in the works this summer. If you prompt me at the end of the program, I might share more details with you. But I want to say that during the last 10 years, since our film first premiered, I've continued to dig into the Olmsted archives, meet with scholars and practitioners, and explore additional Olmsted landscapes, and revisit some of my favorite locations. So allow me to summarize some of the salient content of the film and expand upon it a little and share some of my gleanings with you. Rather than reviewing Olmsted's entire career in this program, although I will come close to that, what I want to simply do is launch him on his career trajectory and hint at some of the stops along the curvilinear path, if you will, that caused him to become America's great park maper. There's sort of an inside joke there, his curvilinear path of his career. His early years, in brief: Frederick Law Olmsted. His life began in Connecticut. In 1822, the first son of a successful merchant, John Olmsted of Hartford, Connecticut. As a youth, Olmsted, father and son, roamed his native Connecticut countryside, literally on his father's saddle by horse, through the beautiful New England landscape. Young Frederick attended several boarding schools in Connecticut, but he had to abandon plans for college due to weak eyesight. He worked briefly for a New York City dry goods importing firm, but the young man was captured by the romance of life at sea. So in 1843, he set off for China as an apprentice seaman. Thus, Fred Olmsted had his year before the mast, if you will, as a seaman sailing to China and back. In fact, it was a harrowing experience, as you read about it in the biographies. He nearly died of scurvy. Olmsted did attend lectures at Yale, including one on the subject of scientific agriculture. In fact, he basically audited his brother's classes at Yale. Though John Hull, the younger brother, did manage to matriculate, not Fred. However, he did spend a great deal of time not only auditing classes, but in the company of some of the Yaleys of the day, his brother's best friends. There we are, his Yaley friends. And I want to point out, here's a photo of Olmsted with his brother. Let's see, here's Frederick. Here's his beloved younger brother, John Hull Olmsted. And over here from the front row on the left-hand side is Charles Loring Brace, who became a very prominent social reformer, was profoundly influenced, the founder of the Children's Aid Society of New York, and had a profound influence on Olmsted's own career. In 1846, Olmsted began to explore a career as a scientific farmer, a field that was on the rise at the time. He apprenticed first at a model farm near Syracuse, New York. Then, with his father's financial assistance, he farms first at Sachem's Head on the Connecticut shore. That doesn't work out real well. It wasn't in a property ideally suited to farming. But subsequently, he buys a larger property on Staten Island, Tosamook Farm. There it is. That's Olmsted's sketch at the bottom there. He makes some improvements at Tosamook Farm. And it's at this time that he starts experimenting with new drainage techniques. The property, by the way, was recently placed on the State Historic Register, and it's now known as the Olmsted Beale House. In 1850, Frederick travels to Europe, and it still exists, by the way. It's not in great shape, but the property still exists. The original farmhouse still exists. In 1850, Frederick travels to Europe and the British Isles in the company of his beloved younger brother, John Hull, and social reformer Charles Loring Brace. Also in 1850, Olmsted is hired by the New York Times to tour the South and file reports from the field. In 1855, Olmsted becomes partner in the firm that publishes the popular Putnam's Monthly magazine. And that business, however, fails in 1857. But that same year, Olmsted's first book about the South, A Journey in the Seaboard Slave States, is published to some considerable acclaim. It wasn't his first publication. It was his first book based on his travels in the South. In 1857 is a momentous year in Olmsted's life. He's appointed the first superintendent of Central Park, and it is after that he, an English-born architect, we have to give credit to Calvert Vaux, they collaborate on the winning design for the park called Greensward. Here is one version of the Greensward plan. With that success, Olmsted is appointed architect-in-chief of Central Park. This is the characteristic picture we almost all see all the time, with his debonair sort of engineer's hat and his cape. Young Olmsted is architect-in-chief. In 1859, he marries Mary Cleveland Perkins Olmsted, his brother's widow, formally adopts her children, raising them as his own. In 1861, what happens in that time period? 1861, Olmsted is appointed General Secretary of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, a Civil War-era national medical relief effort securing aid and supplies for wounded soldiers. More on that in just a few minutes. I'm touching on a few things that I'm going to return to. After resigning his appointment with the Sanitary Commission, Olmsted moves west. He's appointed commissioner of the Yosemite and Mariposa mining estates, John Charles Fremont's gold mine estate in the Sierra Nevada of California. He moves his entire family to the Sierra Nevada. There they are and picnicking in the Mariposa Grove. Here's Frederick Law Olmsted up front with his family, his wife, and they're picnicking in the Mariposa Grove in the Sierra Nevada. There, Olmsted manages a gold mine in a roughneck mining town. While there, he's appointed to a California State Commission, plays a leadership role in writing the first report proposing the permanent protection of Yosemite Valley before John Muir. More about that report later. In 1865, Olmsted is reappointed landscape architect for Central Park, and with Calvert Vaux, he begins work on Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And on Broadway in Manhattan, Olmsted and Vaux opened the first office of landscape architecture practice in the United States, thus launching a unique and famous career. Over the course of his life, Olmsted experienced considerable family tragedy. including early deaths of mother, brother, and children. His own near death in a terrible carriage accident in Central Park that left him maimed for life and was plagued by a nearly lifelong struggle with dark depression and a host of other physical ailments. Toward the end of his life, fighting infirmities and utter exhaustion, he was still designing the landscape for the 1893 World Columbian Exposition of Chicago, also known as the White City, and the grounds of the Biltmore Estate, and supervising the creation of these, his final masterpieces. Then, after a few years of waning mental and physical health, he tragically lost his mind. Olmsted passed away in 1903 at the McLean Asylum on the outskirts of Boston, an institution the very grounds of which he had designed. Now let's review certain aspects of that career. Perhaps we should say careers, plural. His manifold roles of scientific farmer, social reformer, capable administrator, writer, editor, and literary publisher, landscape designer, and last but certainly not least, master park builder. Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. was first and foremost a social reformer. His career was central to the social reform movement of the US during the second half of the 19th century. That is how he described himself before any other attribute or title, social reformer. He was a philosopher of democracy. He read widely and deeply and wrote thoughtfully about the subject and manifested it in his philosophy of park design and in his actual park creations. By the way, he was preparing a magnum opus on the history of civilization that was only ever partially written and only a couple of essays of which ever saw publication. This is what Olmsted had to say about Central Park. This is the opening of the sheep meadow in Central Park, right after coming out of COVID in the spring of 2021. That's when this picture was taken. This is what he had to, taken from two different publications, but two different comments he had to say about Central Park. It is one great purpose of the park to supply to the hundreds of thousands of tired workers who have no opportunity to spend their summers in the country inexpensively what a month or two in the White Mountains or the Adirondacks is at great cost to those in easier circumstances. That's also, in Central Park, you will find all classes largely represented with a common purpose, each individual adding by his mere presence to the pleasure of all others, all helping to the greater happiness of each. You often see vast numbers of persons brought closely together, poor and rich, young and old. By the way, the wealthy of the day in New York, they could go to the Catskills in the Adirondacks. In Boston, patrician Yankee Boston, they could go to the White Mountains with great ease. Not the hardworking blue-collar workers of New York. They had no ability to go to any of these places. Olmsted was, I'll mention this a little bit later, Olmsted was pretty profoundly influenced by the Transcendentalists as well. So Olmsted wanted to provide in New York City easy access so that anyone could have their own Catskills, Adirondacks, White Mountain, or Walden Pond experience by going into a beautiful urban nature sanctuary, Central Park and Prospect Park in Brooklyn. As one of our back to the democratic intent here, as one of our commentators, historian Keith Morgan said, Olmsted intensely believed in democracy and the park as a site for the enactment of democracy. In fact, one could argue, I'll be pointing to a new book at the end, one could argue that Central Park was Olmsted's response to what he witnessed in the South, preceding the Civil War and during the Civil War, and that this great park would provide a counterpoint, a welcoming democratic space where anyone could gather, regardless of origin or background or skin color, and that the park itself, Central Park, would point a way to the future for the nation, healing post-Civil War. Though he strayed away from describing himself as such, he was indeed an artist. As is stated by historian Sarah Cedar Miller, Central Park was arguably the most important piece of American art in the 19th century. In fact, in our film, she says it's the most important piece of American art ever. Clearly, it was the most monumental in scale. Author and Olmsted expert Elizabeth Barlow Rogers had this to say about Central Park in our film, quote, "It is a triumph of 19th century engineering, a symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces." I love that second phrase, a symphonic sequence of beautiful spaces. This is how I like to capture it. While I put up a picture of the Hudson River School. This is, everyone refers to it as the Oxbow. The actual title is After a Thunderstorm by Thomas Cole, who's considered the founder of the Hudson River School of Painters. What the Hudson River School painters were doing with pigment and brush on two dimensions on canvas, Olmsted and early on his collaboration with British architect, English architect Calvert Vaux, were drawing, painting, and sculpting the landscapes of our great cities while working in not 2 dimensions, not 3 dimensions, but in 4 dimensions. What's the 4th dimension here that they were working in, anyone? Time. Well done. Thank you. In Olmsted's own words, I have all my life been considering distant effects, distant in time, and always sacrificing immediate success and applause to that of the future. In laying out Central Park, we determined to think of no results to be realized in less than 40 years. In fact, you don't have to read too much of his writing and experience his parks to realize he wasn't just thinking 40 years ahead. He was thinking, envisioning 100 years into the future, always. Now, I don't have time to do a deep dive into landscape design theory or landscape history. Let me simply say that as a landscape designer, Olmsted was clearly influenced by those who came before him. Practitioners of garden design, deep thinkers in the realm of art, such as John Ruskin. But also, in particular, I want to mention the great English landscape designers, Capability Brown and Humphrey Repton. He was profoundly influenced by those 2 English garden designers, landscape designers. But we also have to give a nod here in the United States to Andrew Jackson Downing, who was so influential in mid-19th century America. In fact, by the way, if it weren't for a terrible steamboat accident on the Hudson River, where Andrew Jackson Downing met a premature death, he would have likely have been appointed the architect designer of Central Park. But his tragic premature death opened up a window for Frederick Law Olmsted to enter the picture. I also want to offer a shorthand for you, a shorthand. Olmsted incorporated aspects of the pastoral and the picturesque in all of his masterworks, the pastoral and the picturesque. There's also the sublime. To a certain degree, it's hard to create a sublime experience in the heart of a big city. The sublime are the White Mountains, the Adirondacks, Niagara Falls. Hard to recreate that in the big city, but you can do the pastoral and the picturesque. So here's the contrast between the sheep meadow. There's the sheep meadow, large sunlit meadow where people can gather in aggregate as they're doing, of course, in this. And then you go within a 1/3 of a mile from the sheep meadow, the pastoral is the Ramble. The Ramble, the birding hotspot of Central Park, curvilinear narrow paths, enclosed woodland, burbling streams, water features, where individuals can have private reveries in nature by themselves, solo, or maybe with a loved one. And you always have that in all of the Olmsted Park masterworks, including here in Portland, certainly at least a couple of parks, and I'll mention that later. As builder of Central Park, Olmsted successfully managed thousands of men in one of the largest construction projects to that point in time in America. During the Civil War, as director of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, in essence, by the way, the Sanitary Commission was the forerunner to the Red Cross. Olmsted perfected his management skills while heading up a huge supply, medical relief, and field hospital operation that including managing a veritable armada of hospital ships from the Chesapeake to the lower Mississippi. He managed an armada of hospital ships as well as all the field hospitals. During this time, he reorganized the entire Army Medical Corps. He coordinated contributions and volunteers from local aid societies. The Sanitary Commission was the largest national public health initiative up to that time in America. Sanitary fairs, by the way, were held in the major cities of the North. Here is one in Philadelphia, sanitary fairs to raise funds to support the Sanitary Commission. Many of the women leaders of the day were leaders in the effort to raise funds to support the Sanitary Commission. Here is one such, Catherine Prescott Wormley. She was also a nurse. She worked in the field right beside Frederick Law Olmsted, wrote descriptively about his personality during that time period, working for him and with him, and what a challenge it was, because he's quite a personality, let me tell you. In fact, both of them were there together. Olmsted was right there in the aftermath of a couple of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War, Antietam and Gettysburg. Right there in the aftermath of Antietam and Gettysburg. Here is the U.S. Sanitary Commission Hospital, Field Hospital in Gettysburg, 1863. I would argue, by the way, that through all these endeavors, Central Park, the Mariposa Gold Mining Estate, the U.S. Sanitary Commission, Olmsted was perfecting his own early version of management science, as he was extremely effective in organizing and directing large groups of people working toward a common goal. And I don't think business historians or professors in business school have actually looked at this quite enough, or organizational development. Arguably, and there's another whole lecture one could give about this, Olmsted was also one of our first systematic thinkers about cities, an urban planner even before that term was coined. Certainly decades and decades before the modern profession of urban planning came into being. However, a field that would come into its own partially under the leadership of his son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., and I'll return to that topic shortly. What about his writings? He was widely published. His earliest publication was a travelogue, a reflective series of essays in the volume Walks and Talks of an American Farmer in England, original publication on the left, modern contemporary version that you can buy today on the right. It's wonderful, very beautiful travelogue of England. And it was that point, particularly while exploring the English countryside, that Olmsted was working out what overarching landscape design concepts he thought best to apply to American soil. And by doing so, to enhance the public park experience for everyone, not just the wealthy elite, as parks were up until that point in time. In fact, Olmsted was particularly inspired by England's very first park, Birkenhead Park, just across the river from today's Liverpool, the very first publicly financed park in England. On another front, the literary republic, if you will, Olmsted's 3 volumes about his journey. Here he is. We sometimes refer to him as FLO or Flo. There he is, as writer, editor, and publisher. His 3 volumes about his journeys in the South and the Plains, through the slave states, and through frontier Texas. 3 different volumes. Texas, by the way, interesting. He wrote graphically about the rough frontier, Hicks towns, where rough justice was met out in, not exactly democratic in any shape or form, of rough frontier Texas. But he made it to the German immigrant communities in Texas Hill Country, and he was bowled over by how neat and communitarian and democratic they were, compared to rough, just 30 miles away, 35, 40 miles away, rough frontier Texas. The Texas hill towns with the German immigrant communities were startling to him. Anyway, all of those volumes that he published were condensed and later reissued and edited with a different editorial tone as The Cotton Kingdom. It's still widely available, his book, The Cotton Kingdom. He even published a map of the Cotton Kingdom. And we might yet see it here. Well, it'll show up. So there it is. There's Olmsted's own map of the Cotton Kingdom. His journalistic career, by the way, started when he was hired by the early iteration of the New York Times, the New York Daily Times. He was one of the first correspondents hired by the New York Times. He, as a roaming correspondent in what seemed to be a foreign land as far as northern readers were concerned, the antebellum South. When his first book was published in England about the economics of slavery, it had a huge impact on intelligentsia and helped sway British public opinion away from supporting the Confederacy and toward the Union side. This is pretty well documented. Yeah, the British public opinion was leaning towards supporting the Confederacy at the outset of in the build-up to the Civil War. Not once Olmsted books made the rounds of intelligentsia in England, they were swayed. It had a huge, it is cited by none other than Charles Darwin as influential as he was thinking about race, as he was preparing The Origin of Species for publication. And Olmsted's book, The Cotton Kingdom, left its mark on the young Malcolm X in prison, hungrily reading and feeding his mind as he was maturing in his political thought and struggling with the concept of race. Had a profound impact. In addition to his stint as publisher and co-editor for Putnam's Monthly, Olmsted co-founded The Nation magazine, and he played a key role as editor of that publication in its early years. During this relatively brief period in his career, Olmsted befriended and published some of the most prominent writers and intellects of the day, including, to name a few, I hope you recognize most of these, Ralph Waldo Emerson. Olmsted was profoundly influenced by Emerson's book on nature. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, here's Herman Melville, and Harriet Beecher Stowe. He knew, befriended, edited, and published all of these writers during his short career as a literary publisher. Additionally, Olmsted had contact with several key painters of the Hudson River School, including notably his cousin from Hartford, Frederick Edwin Church, the second generation of the Hudson River School. Of course, this isn't Church himself. This is his famous canvas of Niagara Falls. There's a reason why I depict Niagara Falls. Well, I could go on. You get the point. Between Putnam's monthly and the nation through his social circle, his ties to the cultural leadership, his contacts were a veritable who's who of the arts and letters of America during this era. To that list can be added many of the leading social reformers of the day. Another whole program could be done about his involvement with social reform and his peers during that time period. We did in our, of note in our film, some of you might have seen it, you might remember, we tried to give some due credit to Calvert Vaux. Let's bring him up, Calvert. Where are you, Calvert? We did try to bring some credit to Calvert Vaux, Olmsted's partner, the man who brought Olmsted into the actual design of Central Park, who subsequently convinced Olmsted to return to the business of park building once Prospect Park was in the offing. Poor Vaux, the sometimes neglected, lesser-known partner, at least to the general public, but a great architect in his own right, yet a man the time seems to have passed over, unlike his partner Olmsted. It's important to understand the origins of the public park movement in North America at this time. In the highly polluted cities of the 19th century, the trees, shrubs, and lawns and parks served as the lungs of the city, creating refuges of fresh air. Park advocates argued that parks provided refined imitations of nature, claiming that exposure to them would improve people's character, regardless of their socioeconomic status. In fact, architect and landscape designer Andrew Jackson Downing wrote this in 1848. This is Downing, not Olmsted. Parks will be better preachers of temperance than temperance societies, better refiners of national manners than dancing schools, and better promoters of general good feeling than any lectures on the philosophy of happiness. I like that. It's Downing, it's not Olmsted, but boy, I think it stands the test of time from 1848. Well, sentiments like that reflect the influence of the Romantics on the New World's attitudes toward nature. What it once had been seen as something separate from humans to be conquered and feared became something humans were part of that they could turn to for restoration. Downing and Olmsted both brought their experiences of touring European gardens to the US, further emphasizing the beneficial relationship between humans and nature and democratizing the public park experience for everyone. Before Central Park, there was only one place in all of New York City for people to recreate in nature: the winding paths of Brooklyn's Greenwood Cemetery. And it's still there today, and it's still as beautiful as ever. It was the principal place for urban New Yorkers to walk in nature. But it wasn't the commoners. It was the gentlefolk, the upper classes, who after church on Sunday would take carriage rides in their finest dress and perambulate around Greenwood Park. It wasn't the commoners who were going to Greenwood Park, no siree. I should emphasize that parks were absolutely seen as instruments for public health, Olmsted in particular, instruments for public health. In the mid-19th century, and they still are, aren't they? In the mid-19th century, New York and all cities were still dealing with terrible outbreaks of cholera and other diseases. In fact, Frederick Law and Mary Olmsted lost their first child due to a cholera outbreak in New York City. And though the epidemiology of such diseases was imperfectly understood at the time, indeed, Central Park served as the lungs of the city. Speaking of which, a little bit more about Central Park. And here's another image of the greensward design. In their argument supporting the design for Central Park, Olmsted and his collaborator Vaux co-wrote this in 1868. Quote, "There is no doubt that the more intense intellectual activity which prevails equally in the library, the workshop, and the counting room makes tranquilizing recreation more essential to continued health and strength. Civilized men are growing more and more subject to insidious enemies to their health and happiness, and against these the remedy cannot be found in medicine or in athletic recreations, but only in sunlight, at such gentle form of exercise as are calculated to equalize the circulation and relieve the brain," unquote. Now, you may not entirely, this is our sort of archaic language there, but you may not entirely agree with their case for passive versus active recreation. And by the way, Olmsted himself, even senior, started incorporating ball fields and other modes of athletic recreation into his later parks, and his sons continued to do that, although he was a very firm believer in the notion of passive recreation. You could see, though, in that fragment that I just shared with you, they were early proponents of what could be called forest bathing, a concept that in fact originated in Japan, but much in vogue at this time. Along with Henry David Thoreau and John Muir, Olmsted was absolutely an early proponent. None of them used that term, but forest bathing, the whole idea behind it. But I have to wonder, folks, I'm going to put this slide up. What's going on here? What's going on here? I have to wonder what Olmsted himself would think if he were with us at this moment in time, when he would see so many people wandering around the outdoors with a soundtrack continuously beaming in their ears, completely oblivious of the natural sounds of nature around them, or like these individuals, not observing the natural world, but rather looking down with their eyes entranced by their shimmering screens. What would Olmsted think? And I will point the finger at myself. I've been there, done this. I know you all have too. Well, now our film zooms in on the stories of Central Park, Prospect Park, Buffalo, and Boston's Emerald Necklace. A few comments about those projects before I move on to other projects and other members of the family, including here in Portland. But both Olmsted and Vaux considered Prospect Park, there it is, Prospect Park. They considered Prospect Park their masterpiece in Brooklyn. For one, they weren't hemmed in by a rectangular area as they were at Central Park. They didn't encounter nearly the same level of political or fiscal interference. Plus, they didn't need to make as many compromises with their design as they were forced to do in Central Park. Now, a little bit about Boston's Emerald Necklace, and more specifically, the Back Bay Fens project that actually preceded the Emerald Necklace. This is the first Olmsted project in Boston. Back Bay Fens, there's the original Olmsted plan on the left. Here's a modern day graphic depiction of the fens on the right. Let's see, I have another couple of images for you. Here's a larger picture of the Back Bay Fens complex. Look at all that blue water and all that green. And this can be pointed to, by the way, this was the transformation of a tidal basin that was part of the public sewers of the city of Boston. And this is what it looks like now. It can be pointed to as the first true wetland restoration project in the history of the United States, what Olmsted did there in the Back Bay Fens. I could talk about many of the delightful discoveries in the making of this film. In fact, one was Buffalo. Anyone been there in recent years? Before beginning research on this film, I hadn't been to Buffalo since I was 6 years old. And boy, have I become a fan of Buffalo and Louisville, by the way. They're two of my favorite Olmsted Park cities, I'll tell you. But anyway, let's see, what do I have for you here? I have a picture of the Buffalo Park system. You're going to see a picture subsequently of the Seattle park system. Looks like this, but this is the first integrated park system ever built in the world. The first integrated park system ever built in the world, with large and small parks connected by landscape parkways and large landscaped traffic circles. The whole idea behind it is that you have a city contained within a park. A city contained within a park, so that anyone, no matter who they were, where they lived, with easy short distance walk, horseback, or bicycle, could have access to a park-like environment. And guess what? Park and recreation departments all over America, including right here in Portland, are still trying to achieve that, so that anyone can have within 10 minutes easy, maybe drive in this instance, easy access to a park-like environment, and park systems still are working to achieve that goal, which Olmsted and Vaux created for the city of Buffalo in the late 19th century. Integrated park system. And here are parkways. Well, here's two of those parks. That's Delaware Park on the left, fabulous Delaware Park. This is Front Park on the right. And here are two of the parkways. Historic Lincoln Parkway on the left. Look at the equestrian traffic in the middle, and modern day Bidwell Parkway on the right. These aren't just narrow little green strips. They're large linear parks that crisscross the city of Buffalo, connecting large and small parks so that everyone has access to green space. Olmsted and Vaux invented parkways in Buffalo. They never had been utilized before to that extent, by the way. Green parkways. Now you have also, what about Niagara Falls? Well, Olmsted, the Niagara Falls State Reservation, New York State, designed by Olmsted and Vaux. A little background is in order here. In the 1860s at Yosemite, Olmsted had advanced the theory that a republic had a responsibility to protect scenic beauty. In the 1870s, he put theory into practice at the highly degraded industrial site of Niagara Falls. Well, there it is. Whoops. There it is. That's what Niagara Falls looked like, folks. Yes. That portions of Niagara Falls look like that. Not all of it. You did have a major waterfall, but it was hidden from view. You had to pay a token to go up and over a blind. It was like an amusement park thing, so you could get a glimpse of the big waterfall. But much of it also looked like this. And Olmsted launched an international campaign to preserve the waterfall complex called the Free Niagara Movement. And there it is. That's one of the campaign literatures for the Free Niagara movement. It amounted to the first big national campaign for scenic preservation. I entirely agree with the commentary in our films. Sure, the falls themselves are powerful, but if you go out to Goat Island, by the way, that campaign succeeded. And it resulted in the state of New York condemning the industry, clearing it out, creating the first state park in the nation. And they hired none other than Olmsted and Vaux to landscape the park on the American side of the river. And their jewel in the crown of that, Olmsted and Vaux considered it Goat Island, which is above. Here's the waterfall complex. The Goat Island is in the rapids above the waterfall. And the commentary in our film, I entirely agree with. You go out to Goat Island, and here's the bridge, the first bridge that leads out to Goat Island, also designed by Olmsted and Vaux, of course. That's a Olmstedian bridge. And then there's a second bridge that leads out to the Three Sisters Islands. We might yet see it. There it is. And then you take a pedestrian bridge and you're surrounded by rapids above the waterfall. And it's a completely different transforming experience than seeing the big spectacle of the waterfall from either side, the New York side or the Ontario side. Now, before I turn to Olmsted Jr., I want to take in a few minutes to talk about the City Beautiful movement. We have to understand the role of the City Beautiful movement. In his work on the World Columbian Exposition, let's see if I have a picture for you here. I think I do. There it is. The World Columbian Exposition, the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. In his work on this, the elder Olmsted had further developed his ideas for planning a comprehensive system of parks, shaping the land to create spaces that seemed natural, but in fact had been highly designed to achieve a particular effect. He believed that cities can be improved through the application of the principles of landscape architecture. In a democracy, Olmsted argued, the health of the republic relied on the civic health of the voting population. And the public parks, here's Lake Park in Milwaukee, Olmsted Sr., often pointed to as a characteristic City Beautiful park on the waterfront of Milwaukee, that public parks in and of themselves could enhance the civic strength of a community. And the City Beautiful movement really arguably was launched nationwide. It was a big statement in Chicago for the City Beautiful movement, building the City Beautiful. And it was Daniel Burnham, some of you will recognize the name, the great impresario of the Chicago World's Fair, the 1893 World Columbian Exposition, famous big ego Daniel Burnham, who was famous for this expression, make no little plans. And boy, did he have an impact on Chicago. Some of you might have read The Devil in the White City, but there he is. And he used the exposition, he was the director of the fair. He used the exposition as a showcase to show how architecture, landscape design, art, and plan development could create the White City. And here is Olmsted's White City of the Chicago World's Fair, a beautiful, orderly, functional space that contrasted sharply with the many chaotic and disorderly urban areas at that time. I fully realized that the White City was a temporary stage set, a folly, a utopian fantasy, as all world fairs have always been and still are, although I don't think we seem to be well beyond the World's Fair era, aren't we? But they are always utopian fantasies to show off the latest and greatest of technology and largely neglect the social ills at the time that they were surrounded with. But anyway, it did set something significant in motion, including what would become known as the Macmillan Plan for Washington, D.C. The Macmillan Plan for D.C. So speaking of the plan, I want to turn to Senior's namesake, his own son, his younger son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., often referred to as Rick, the younger brother who was brought into the family practice. He left a considerable mark across America. I'm going to speed through some of this for the sake of time, but he did, there he is, young Rick. He did attend Harvard, by the way. He studied botany in a way and horticulture in a way that his father never had. His father insisted, Rick, you need to get to know your plants. The father felt inadequately trained in those areas. In the waning years of his life, the father included this young son in the culminating projects of his career. While still a student at Harvard, young Olmsted spent a summer working in Daniel Burnham's office as the World Columbian Exposition rose in Chicago. There it is. And at Biltmore, he worked at both. In fact, on the 100,000 acre estate being developed at for George Vanderbilt in Asheville, North Carolina. And by the way, for those of you who've been to Biltmore, it's not just the beautiful gardens immediately adjacent to the famous house. It's the entire 100,000 acre estate. Olmsted master planned the entire 100,000 acre estate. All the roadways, all the paths, all the plantings, all the shrubbery, all the flowers, all the trees. Olmsted literally designed it to almost every individual blade of grass. It's pretty crazy, but that's what he was able to do. Then the younger son joined the older son, a full partner with his half brother, John Charles, in the family. Oh, here's another picture of those gardens. But here, this is the family practice, Fairstead, in Brookline, Massachusetts. It's now the Frederick Law Olmsted National Historic Site. You can go there, you can see exhibits, take tours with National Park Rangers, you can visit the archives, you can visit the actual drafting rooms as they looked in the mid 20th century. They've been restored, they've been maintained at that level. It's quite extraordinary, well worth the visit if you're interested. Both sons, by the way, the junior and his junior, here he is at Fairstead. Both sons co-founded the American Society of Landscape Architects, along with a few others, the ASLA, the first and most prestigious professional organization for landscape architects, co-founded by the two Olmsted brothers. He emerged on the national scene, Junior did, in 1901 with the Macmillan Plan for Washington, D.C. And he was charged with carrying out Pierre Charles L'Enfant's vision of the nation's capital for the 20th century. He worked with his father's own colleagues from the Chicago World's Fair to transform Washington into a work of civic art. And a partial listing of Junior's projects in the nation's capital reads like a guide to Washington, D.C., including the National Mall, including the Jefferson Memorial, all the landscapes, including the National Zoo, also the National Cathedral, and the executive mansions. What do we know the executive mansions are? The White House. He made improvements to the White House grounds. They obviously pre-existed. The Olmsted brothers made improvements. And they designed, completely master planned, Rock Creek Park and Rock Creek Parkway, which is a huge amenity. I have to be careful using that term, but it's a wonderful bonus for the city of Washington, D.C. to have Rock Creek Park and Parkway running right through the heart of it, north to south. Now, by the way, speaking of the nation's capital, a little segue here, a little side note. I want to remind you that it was Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. who left his mark there prior to his son. He did extensive landscaping work on the U.S. Capitol grounds. This is Sr., the father, reorienting the entrance and designing and seeing to the installation of the Capitol steps. Olmsted created and built the Capitol steps. Well, given what is always in the news these days, remember Olmsted Sr. saw all his public commissions as public spaces where Americans would enact democracy. I wonder what Mr. Olmsted would have thought about the events of January 6th if that was his version of the enactment of democracy. Rhetorical question. In August 2015, the National Park Service hosted a special event commemorating the 150th anniversary of Olmsted's historic report. Maybe I have a copy of it here for you. There it is, the Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of Big Trees. That report is credited with providing the basis for the creation of Yosemite National Park. There it is. I have to give you at least one beautiful picture. That report's thoughtful wording is considered by many to be the first step in the establishment of our national park system. And you might remember that the National Park Service celebrated its 100th anniversary in 2016. In fact, it was Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. who played a key role in writing the Organic Act of 1916, the founding legislation for the U.S. National Park Service, like father, like son. Okay, for 30 years, Rick advised the National Park Service on the creation of national parks. So Acadia National Park, Everglades National Park, Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and Yosemite, all advised by the Olmsted brothers. And let's look at residential complexes briefly, then I'll move to John Charles in the Pacific Northwest. I'm having this delay problem. This is the father's residential complex, Riverside, Illinois, quite extraordinary, the first planned green garden suburb in the United States. Junior followed suit with Forest Hills Gardens in Queens, Roland Park in Baltimore, Mountain Lakes Historic District, it's now an historic district, Mountain Lakes in Lake Wales, Florida, and here is the Bok Tower Gardens, Junior's botanical garden masterpiece. Yes, there are highlands in Central Florida. That's the location of the Bok Tower Gardens in Lake Wales. And going west quickly, Denver Mountain Parks, the entire Denver Mountain Park system, master planned by the Olmsted brothers under the leadership of Junior. Anyone been to Denver, the Denver Mountain Park system? Here's the Chief Hosa Lodge, the bison herd in the oldest park of that system, Genesee Park. One of the newer parks in that park system added since Olmsted's time is Red Rocks Park. Some of you might know that for its famous amphitheater. And he did city planning for the city of Boulder, Colorado. Here's a picture of Boulder today. And here is Olmsted Sr. in California, Mountain View Cemetery, California, Oakland, California. That's Sr. Sr. worked with Leland Stanford to create the campus plan for Stanford University. There's the architectural plan. Here are images for you of its cohesive campus. And here's an aerial of that campus, all co-designed by client working with architect, designer, Stanford and Olmsted together. And then Palos Verdes, California. Oh, here's the Berkeley Hills. This is the East Bay Regional Park District above the hills in Berkeley and Oakland and the surrounding communities of East Bay, a very large complex park system, all master planned by Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and the Olmsted brothers. And the entire California State Park System, master planned twice over by Olmsted Jr. and the Olmsted brothers, including the protection of the redwoods in the Santa Cruz Mountains and the largest state park in all of California, the only large desert state park in California, the Anza Borrego Desert. There it is under a full bloom. And Palos Verdes, the largest residential complex designed by the Olmsted brothers. The entire community of Palos Verdes, all master planned by the Olmsteds. Very sophisticated, complex plan. Park, residential areas, commercial areas, public gathering spots, parks and trails, all master planned by the Olmsted brothers. You also heard about the plan for the LA Basin. Well, here it is, the Olmsted Bartholomew plan for Los Angeles. That's the map that they drew up at the time in that 1930 report that was completely disregarded by the economic and political interests of LA at the time that were only interested in one thing, development and nothing else, not green space. And I'm going to skip over this. So I'm going to just introduce this fellow very quickly. Here's John Charles Olmsted. Here he is working at Fairstead. He graduated from Yale and actually very quickly joined the firm and led the firm with his younger brother, but he was really the leader for a period of years. The first countywide park system in the United States, Branch Brook Park, notably, right in downtown Newark. Who knew? There are the cherry blossoms in bloom. It's extraordinarily beautiful. An entire county park system. The New York State Capitol in Albany with Calvert Vaux as a partner. And here he is in the Pacific Northwest. He came to the area and he was enchanted by our landscapes. Here is Puget Sound. He was enchanted by the tall trees, by the irregular terrain, by the views of snow-capped mountains everywhere he went. The three cities of Portland, Spokane, and Portland, in essence, cost shared, especially cheap Portland. They couldn't afford him. But they brought him out here. Here's a view of Mount Rainier from the 1920s in Seattle. Here he is again, John C. Olmsted. And look at that. He arrived the perfect Bostonian, and after spending a little time in the Pacific Northwest, he adopted the Sherlock Holmes look. Go figure. And the funny thing is, I moved here at the end of 1994, and in 1 year, the same thing happened to me. Go figure. Anyway, so first he created the 1905, the whole landscape for the 1905 Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition, very near here at Giles Lake. Here is he did the same thing in 1909, the AYP of the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition. Right here, this is Rainier Vista. This is the centerpiece of today's UW campus. Right there, it's still there. I was just there last week. Still looks like this, except with a few modern buildings. Largely, it looks like that, but of course, that's an exaggerated art. Here's another picture of the Centennial Exposition. Here's another image, again, Giles Lake, and he master planned the whole thing. Like all World's Fairs, they're all temporary and they're follies, and it had its own time and place, but it helped put Portland on the national map. And some of you know this fellow, Lester Leander Hawkins, L.L. Hawkins, Colonel L.L. Hawkins. Does anyone know Bill Hawkins? Bill Hawkins' great uncle. I'll spare you the details on Bill, but he's still with us, still living, an extraordinary architectural historian here in Portland. L.L. Hawkins met John C. Olmsted at the train station with his buggy, Tally-ho, and he rode over hill and dale all over Portland, showing Olmsted the great prospects for parks in Portland. Here is the Tally-ho Jupiter at the, I think that's the Multnomah Hotel. And here's Markham Hill, 1920. This is the kind of landscape that Olmsted saw, J.C. Olmsted. And he wrote this 1903 report, which is considered the most perfect park board report ever written because of the 18 benchmarks, which are still a guide to the creation of a modern, sustainable, supportable park system and all the steps you need to take to have such a park, to implement and to maintain such a park system. It's a guiding document to this day in urban park systems across America, and actually it had worldwide impact, this 1903 report. Here's that report. Here's how it was featured in the Oregonian, the front page of the Oregonian. And here is Emil Misch, that's the anointed architect, studied with the Olmsteds. John C. Olmsted said to the Portland Park Board, "You need a park superintendent. I highly recommend this fellow, Emmanuel T. Misch. He will carry out my work." And he did. And it was under the leadership of Mish that we have Maclay Park. You all recognize this, Terwilliger Parkway. Peninsula Park with its beautiful roses in full bloom right now. Here's the plan for Laurelhurst Park. Here is Laurelhurst Park today, often pointed to as the most perfect Olmstedian park in all of Portland, but designed by Mish in the Olmsted aesthetic, under the supervision, if you will, at a distance of the Olmsted brothers in Boston. And Ladd Circle, and Kenilworth Park, and I'm showing you about a few, Selwood Park, Mount Tabor Park. Here's another beautiful view from the summit of Mount Tabor, and the Peter Kerr Estate Garden, the most perfect estate that they designed. You all know it as Elk Rock Gardens, once again reopened to the public, once again under family ownership, by the way. And he said, you have that large chunk of old growth forest extending northwest from the city. Don't develop it, protect it. And now we have Forest Park, 5,100 acres, the largest urban forest reserve in the United States, thanks to John, partially thanks to John C. Olmsted's recommendations. Now, oh, here's a bridge in Forest Park. I can't but help show a few, and here's the Hoyt Arboretum, some other pretty pictures. By the way, Pacific University, Olmsted, Forest Grove, the original campus, Olmsted. Linfield University, it was McMinnville College when Olmsted was there, in McMinnville, Olmsted. Memorial Union Quadrangle, Oregon State University, all designed by Olmsted. It's now on the historic register as the National Historic District, all because of Olmsted's original design. Same thing at Whitman College in Walla Walla and the University of Idaho. There's an original picture. Here is what it looks like today. All master designed portions of these historic campuses designed by Olmsted. Finally, let's talk briefly, then I'll bring it to a close. Here's some quick pictures. Let's not neglect Spokane, some parks in Spokane, all master planned by John C. Olmsted. And here is the Uplands planned in Victoria, BC, a residential area, all master planned by Olmsted, John C. Olmsted. It's his largest residential commission, actually, of John C. Olmsted's, up just east of today's Victoria. It's in a nearby constituency called Oak Bay on Vancouver Island. All John C. Olmsted, and then here's the plan for Seattle. Look at that. 35 parks and parkways, the most extensive park system built by the Olmsteds in all of the Pacific Northwest. Volunteer Park, there it is today. Here's Green Lake Park. I was just there. I was just here too at Washington Park Arboretum. Madrona Park, Woodlands Park, where the zoo is now in Seattle. Lake Washington Boulevard, what an amazing, beautiful boulevard that still is today, and Seward Park, among other sites in Seattle. The most extensive Olmsted Brothers Park plan for all the Pacific Northwest in Seattle, and a major portion of today's campus, state capitol campus in Olympia, all Olmsted Brothers. The West Capitol and Capitol Lake, all Olmsted Brothers. So I'm finally going to close. I had to speed through that, but I have this picture up for parks for the people here. I'm going to bring it to a close. Parks have been lifesavers for so many of us, seeking fresh air, exercise, physical and psychological health. Olmsted, Frederick Law Olmsted Sr. now appears so entirely prescient as he emphasized public health, mental health, and taking it even further, spiritual health benefits of the public park experience for everyone in a democracy. I want to leave you with these thoughts as we share another couple of pictures here. This is what landscape architect Faye Harwell had to say about reflecting on her childhood experiences in Central Park. Sometimes we don't even know that we've been experiencing an Olmsted Park. If you think of those tiny little experiences multiplied over all of those thousands of parks, this is really a huge, huge impact on human experience in America. Daniel Burnham, the driving force for the World Columbian Exposition. When the World's Fair was about to open in 1893, at a dinner with all of the artists and architects gathered to laud Burnham for his achievements, Burnham pivoted and talked about his absent collaborator at this dinner program. And this is the John Singer Sargent portrait of Olmsted that's famously up on the wall there at the Biltmore Estate. This is Burnham talking about Olmsted, his collaborator. Each of you knows the name and genius of him who stands first in the heart and confidence of American artists, the creator of your own parks. Frederick Law Olmsted, an artist. He paints with lakes and wooded slopes, with lawns and banks and forest-covered hills, with mountainsides and ocean views. He should stand where I do tonight, not for the deeds of later years alone, but for what his brain hath wrought and his pen has taught for half a century. And we'll finally let Frederick Law Olmsted himself close with his own words. I love this artwork from the Boston Globe. The beauty of the park should be in the beauty of the fields, the meadow, the prairie, of the green pastures and the still waters. What we want to gain is tranquility and rest to the mind. Is it doubtful that it does men good to come together this way in pure air and under the light of heaven? Frederick Law Olmsted. And no, undoubtedly, if you were writing that today, he would have said men and women. Well, it seems to me that that prescription, if you will, rings as loud today in 2024 as it did in the late 19th century. Thank you, Frederick Law Olmsted and Sons, and thanks to all of you for coming out this morning. Thank you.
Oh, wow.
I have books to recommend, but I won't take the time just now by showing you pictures, but I could certainly recommend books, and I could recommend websites for you to learn more about the Olmsted legacy across America.
And we have a lot of questions. So it's a question and you're going to keep it short. I'm going to, Hank Rob, why don't you come on in from Zoom and ask your question?
I have a lot of questions, but I'll ask an ephemeral one.
One.
What's Rick doing at Harvard and not Yale?
I'm not sure of the point of your question. Are you just simply, what was he doing at Harvard and not Yale?
Yes, I mean, these are all Yale people. Why does he go to Harvard?
Oh, well, because they were living in Boston at the time. And Olmsted already had a relationship with Harvard University. Olmsted Sr., the father, already had a relationship with Harvard University through Eliot, the president of Harvard, and his son, who was a young up-and-coming draftsman in the Olmsted office. So there was already a relationship between Olmsted and Harvard, and it was accessible, easily accessible. I don't, for whatever reason, they made the decision instead of setting the John Charles was at Yale, but Rick went to Harvard.
Okay.
Thanks.
I don't have, yep.
Thank you. Questioner number two. It looks like that's Albert.
Yes, I'm a proponent of leisure time, active, recreational music playing in parks. I used to do this in Texas down in Old City Park with a bunch of friends, and it was very welcoming. But lately, parks don't seem quite as friendly to me for going out and playing music in the park. Because you emphasize the symphony.
Question now.
Yes, you emphasize the symphony of nature, etc. Are you okay with playing music in the park, or how can we make that work?
Well, first of all, I'm not an authority. I don't represent any particular park service. I'm a lonely independent with some thoughts on this topic. I would say as long as it's acoustic music and it's not too loud, why not? You know, I would imagine some people would have problems with an accordion.
Mhm.
Some people might have problems with a banjo. I happen to like both accordions and banjos, I'll have you know. But I would say if it's acoustic music and if it's not played too loudly, why not? Maybe even a harmonica, again, if it's not played too loudly, but acoustic, non-amplified and not too loudly. But gee, seems to me we have individuals playing electric guitars with small amplifiers. And I understand that might, certainly you find that in Central Park. I don't know if you find that so much in Portland parks, but you'll find that in Central Park.
But those guys are licensed.
I think.
I don't want to get licensed.
I understand. Well, there's a difference between a licensed busker, which I also saw just last week in Seattle. Seattle has arrangements in all of its major parks with park concierges on duty all weekday hours. All of their parks have park concierges, and they have licensed buskers with a schedule to appear in their parks. And part of the idea here is, by the way, is activation. If you activate a park and you people a park, less likelihood for troublemakers,
That's right.
less likelihood for trashers, less likelihood for graffiti artists, and frankly, forgive me, but less likelihood for homeless sleepers as well.
Mhm.
If you activate a park with people who are actively using it during daylight hours. Yeah.
Okay.
Anyway, but I'm in favor of softly played acoustic music in parks. I have no problem with that. Okay, he actually knew the president. He met him at least twice, as far as I know, although Lincoln once wrote critically of Olmsted during the time of the Sanitary Commission. But he identified himself as a Lincoln Republican, and unquestionably in today's descriptive world, I think he would probably be painted as a liberal Democrat, most likely, in terms of his overall. He was patrician, but that was that era. He was raised in a patrician family. He was patrician, so that applied. But I think in today's parlance, he would be identified most likely, maybe even self-identified as a liberal Democrat. I'm taking a bit of a leap, but I think that's probably the case. or certainly a moderate Democrat, or an ultra-liberal Republican.
There's a comment from, I think it's from Hank Robb. Would you ask the speaker to run through his slides with the names of books on Olmsted Park so that those viewing, do you have?
I
is it-
think-
I think,
I do. If I can screen share again.
I think we've got time. You
Is it
got a
up?
question,
No.
honey?
Okay.
Okay,
But the whole idea behind the Cotton Kingdom was, sure, he used the title, the Cotton Kingdom, but it was an analysis of the economics of slavery.
Mhm.
It was an analysis of the economics of slave labor in the South versus free labor in the North.
Mhm.
It was from the point of view of the economics of the plantation economy, not so much about the market for cotton. Well, although clearly he knew about it, and clearly, yes, in the Sanitary Commission, he would have had to acquire cotton for the bandages and so on and so forth. But I can't tell you, more particulars about that. But let
Okay.
me run through. I still need to go to
those books, yeah, and this, I believe, we are recording, so
yes.
this, go ahead, this
So-
will be on your YouTube and.
Yes, and I'm not sure if I can get this thing to work again. We'll try.
Dave will get you.
It's out of print, but maybe you can find it if you're lucky on the shelves at Powell's. Greenscapes, Olmsted's Pacific Northwest by an old friend of mine, Joan Hockaday. Maybe you can. Oh, here, someone might know Bill Hawkins. This is the legacy of the Olmsted brothers in Portland, Oregon, self-published by Bill Hawkins. You can find them on the shelf at Powell's. It's also maybe recently out of print because he's self-published, but I know that there are copies at Powell's specifically about the Olmsted brothers in Portland. Here are the national books. My favorite, A Clearing in the Distance by Witold Rybczynski. Some of you know his name. Some of you might know this book. That's my favorite biography. I think it was first released maybe about 25 years ago. Here's a more recent biography, maybe
Yeah.
Genius of Place by Justin Martin. I also recommend this one. It was released about 12 years ago, I want to say. This is a classic text. You could also find used copies on the shelves of Powell's. Frederick Law Olmsted, Designing the American Landscape by Charles Beveridge, a classic text by the scholar who's getting on in age. Here is a new biography of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. by Elizabeth Hope Cushing, just published 2 years ago. Here are two of my favorite books coming up right now. The Power of Scenery, Frederick Law Olmsted and the Origin of National Parks by Dennis Drabell. By the way, 2022 was the Olmsted Bicentennial. A lot of literature came out preceding and during the bicentennial period, including this one. And this next one is another one of my favorites, Olmsted and Yosemite, Civil War, Abolition, and the National Park Idea by Rolf Diamant and Diamant, it's pronounced, and Ethan Carr, who is another acquaintance of mine. So those are some volumes I recommend. Do I have one more here? Maybe not. I might have the website for our film. It just flew by. If you want to take a screenshot, everyone, this takes you to the website for our film. There it is. It's an awfully complex URL. You can find our film if you go to pbs.org, Amazon, or YouTube. But if you go directly to this website, there's a whole lot more. There are many additional videos, bonus videos, and there's a whole slew of essays about the Olmsted legacy on our proprietary website. So if you take a screenshot of a picture of that, it'll take you directly to the proprietary website for our film. So there you go. There's some there's my recommended syllabus for you to follow up for those of you who care to delve more deeply into the Olmsted legacy. So thank you again, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah.
Lawrence, that was just lovely. And I had no idea that that man did so much. Just phenomenal. We owe him so much. We wouldn't have the parks here in Portland, certainly, but all over the country without him.
Correct?
Yeah, and including the national park. I mean, I just think of him as formal parks,
Yeah.
not the national parks.
Well, there were other people working out there. Horace Cleveland is one. Some people might recognize that name from the Twin Cities and Chicago and so forth. Then there were others who were working and active around that same time, pulling similar ideas out of the ether
Right.
and implementing them. So we would certainly have parks, but there's no question that Renaissance man Olmsted was rather unique
Yes.
in terms of the
yes.
legacy that he and his sons left us, including John Charles Olmsted in the Pacific Northwest.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's another whole thing. But Olmsted saw that he was critical of the South because of the lack of public infrastructure, lack of public parks, public gathering spaces, public libraries, civic infrastructure of all kinds for people, public space for people to gather. It was all hung up on the plantation economy and the extreme inequities of wealth and poorly developed towns, centers, and so forth. And he was saying, "Well, look at the North. We're a little bit." He was maybe a little arrogant, perhaps at times, but he was pointing out the differences between northern cities and southern cities for the difference in attitudes towards public infrastructure. And parks and libraries, among other things, are very much a part of that. And as I said earlier, they're essential. They're not just amenities. They're essential. Yeah.
Well, thank you so
Okay.
much.
Yep.
Thank you so much. I
Yep.
think we've got a little bit of time to make some announcements
Sure.
now.
Thank
and
you.
Thank you. That's
Yep.
just thank you.